From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. You know, the subtitle of this series is about the empowerment of people. It's about Montana shedding its copper collar and people being empowered. And one of the ways in which empowerment took place during this period of In the Crucible of Change was in the political arena. And tonight we're going to talk specifically about the changes inside the Montana Democratic Party. We call this small d, democratizing of the Democratic Party. And so while we focus so much upon the change from being a corporate colony to a citizen state, in this case we're going to be looking at a specific institution, a political institution of the Democratic Party in Montana, and see how it was democratized by the events and the movement of the period we're looking into. So the Crucible of Change period started in 1965, and the real change inside the Democratic Party in Montana started to take place in the 1967 to 68 period. And it was in the context of the national movements as well. With the Vietnam War specifically was causing great concern all across the country, and it found a focal point in change within the Democratic Party because people who needed to run for president had to go through that process. Now, our two guests for this show were both heavily involved in the Democratic Party at that time. One was a longtime top leader of labor in Montana, and as such a top leader in the Democratic Party in Montana, and the other was just emerging as a newcomer in the political arena at the time. And we're lucky to have them both here with us today because they have so much to offer on the subject. So I want to introduce the people who are here with us today. First, I want to introduce Marilyn Maney. Marilyn Maney Ross. She was known as Marilyn Maney back then. Marilyn was a McGovern activist in the 1972 period. She later worked in a job program for the Montana State AFL-CIO. She worked about 20 years with the Butte Archives. She is a noted historian. She led the Butte Archives into winning a National History Award for labor history. She later became a Madison County Commissioner, so she's a former elected official now, and has been 8 years the chairman of the Montana Heritage Commission. So we want to welcome Marilyn here, and then also glad to see you here.
Thanks for asking me, Evan. This is a real pleasure.
And next we have Jim Murry. Jim was 26 years with the Montana State AFL-CIO, 24 as its top leader, and he was one of the top labor leaders in the nation. And as I have mentioned before, in 1982, right at the end of this period of Crucible of Change, a top survey of Montana's top 100 leaders was who was the most influential leader in Montana during this period. And at the time, and it was 1982, and number one on that list was Governor Ted Schwinden, and number two was Jim Murry. So he was up to his eyeballs in everything that was going on politically and economically and governmentally in the period of change that we're talking about, including huge involvement with the Democratic Party, which again is our subject for today. And I want to also mention that, you know, I've often said Montana's a small town with really long streets. We all know each other still. Frankly, we're all friends for all these years, 40 years. And so this is as much a conversation. It's not an interview, it's a conversation about things we're all familiar with. And so back to the context. Vietnam. Vietnam was causing great fuss in the Democratic Party and across the entire nation. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts as a young person just entering the process at that time. What brought you to the table to want to find a voice or whatever?
Well, I think calling the Vietnam War a major fuss, sort of an understatement. But I think for young people my age, and I was 18 in 68, that was the one sole issue that we were all completely focused on, was the Vietnam War. Some of us had family members that had been drafted. Others, we all had friends. We all knew somebody. So that was the galvanizing issue. And I think we tended to see things as absolutely black or white. You were either against the war or you were for the war. And it was the Democratic Party that seemed to be the only vehicle expressing that anti-war feeling. In 1968 in Chicago, the convention in Chicago, there were actually two conventions. There was the one on the inside that was actually deciding things, and then there were all the rest of us that were on the outside, and as everyone knows, it was very violent, a lot of tear gas. It was really a very, very, that was a fuss, a big fuss. And the lesson that, at least personally, that I took away from that was, if we had any hope of changing things, ending the war, changing that military focus, that we couldn't stay outside in the street. We had to somehow figure out how to get inside that hall and be one of those people that was, whose opinion counted, that somebody cared what we thought.
Your voice, not just your voice, but your vote.
Exactly,
essentially.
yes. Yeah.
And that was where it kind of all started back in Chicago. Jim, you were back there as a delegate.
I was a delegate. I was on the inside for that convention.
And there were big problems happening in '68. The context of that was that because of the Vietnam War, everyone wanted Bobby Kennedy to run for president, but he wasn't ready to. So Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota declared, and after he went through New Hampshire, he almost beat Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president. He was so close that they called it a victory for McCarthy. 4 days after that, Bobby Kennedy declared. So now Bobby Kennedy and McCarthy were both running, and Lyndon Johnson was the president, and his vice president was Hubert Humphrey, a real hero to labor and to progressives, a real genuine hero, who was the vice president to Lyndon Johnson. And lo and behold, 14 days after that, Lyndon Johnson withdrew, and everything was in turmoil. And so McCarthy and Kennedy moved forward, trying to get delegates, and Humphrey announced his candidacy, obviously, as vice president at that time, but there were no more nominating conventions he could take. So he had to run outside the process, and lo and behold, outside the process, he was winning. And that caused a lot of concern, which led to the Hughes Commission being named ahead of there, and the Hughes Commission came in and says, we need to change some things inside this room, inside the convention. We need to change some things. And time would show that they really did need to. Give us your reflections on how that was playing out nationally and then how that affected things in Montana.
Well, first, Evan, thank you for having me here again. And this is kind of it's really a reunion, isn't it?
It is.
Old friends. The three of us have worked together for so long. Marilyn was not only on the other side in that during those years she supported George McGovern. I was on the other side, but she was a sister from our labor
Yes.
movement, and was deeply involved with a whole bunch of young people that said, "Hey, we want to change things. We have to change things." We, as the years went by, we worked together at the AFL-CIO, and we've had a friendship that has gone on all these years. That is really wonderful, and this is just great. But the thing that I remember about all of that was that there was really a concern. At that time, I was one of the youngest leaders. I think I was the youngest leader in the nation of all the state feds. So I was surrounded by older people, both brothers and sisters, that had a pretty conservative view about these changes that these kids were insisting upon, and they resisted that. They resisted that with all their might. I was a little bit probably more inclined to be with the kids than I was with the older folks, but those were the people that were delegates to the conventions where I had to seek re-election, and it was kind of like walking across a minefield trying to keep all of this straight and all of it together. But the one thing I would emphasize in those years that I think was really great, and that was we had these great disagreements. And gee, Marilyn, you talk about those conventions and that, boy, people people were really upset. But what we did is we focused on keeping this coalition together in Montana that allowed all of us to work together. We had to figure out how we were going to facilitate that as much as anything. And in those days, as we were going through these dramatic changes in Montana, that meant we had to work together in political campaigns to elect people to public office that cared about people. We had to have an impact legislatively during those legislative sessions, and we all worked in our communities year round to set a political tone. And all of that fit well for me because I was attracted to the labor movement. You've heard me say this so many times in the past. I was attracted to the labor movement because, to me, that was the greatest vehicle there was to bring about needed social change for everybody in America, whether they carried a union card or not.
Absolutely.
What an exciting place to be. And the only way we could make those things happen was by working together and keeping everybody in the family. And so I used to make the comparison about my own family, and we had a pretty large family. There were a lot of disagreements, and you had to figure out how you dealt with those disagreements, always keeping your family together. And we were able to do that. It was it was really an interesting time.
It was interesting that ultimately that was the objective, and with your leadership, labor stayed actively and heavily involved. That wasn't always true in every state. In Montana, when the delegates election started taking place in the spring of 1968, it was based in the Democratic Party on the election of precinct committee people.
Right, yes.
Whoever could get the most precinct committee people registered for their candidate might have more votes at the county convention that would reflect themselves upward, and you'd get delegates.
Convention.
Right.
And you could take it all.
Now, speaking of grassroots, in Butte, getting delegates registered to people to run for county commission, how did a couple of the McGovern people decide to do that?
Well, it was, it was not only just grassroots. I mean, we were really in the roots, and a couple of the really very committed McGovern folks, Don Cooney and Chaz Jeniker, were literally going through the neighborhoods and knocking on doors and convincing people that they should go up to the county courthouse and register and throw their name in as precinct committee. Now, mind you, we didn't know exactly what that meant, but they were gathering up, and one of them, and I don't know which one, had an old flatbed truck, and they were going through the neighborhoods of Butte getting people that had said, yeah, okay, we'll do that, and loading them on that flatbed truck to get them up to the courthouse.
Taking them to the courthouse.
Taking them to the courthouse, which really, and so many of us signed up to run, and then realized that, oh, my name is going to be on a ballot. That means I have to go out and round up some votes, get some votes. And so I had to do that, going door to door. The problem, like so many of us had, was we weren't exactly sure what a precinct committee man or woman would do, but we needed the vote to get to the central committee. And because many of the committee people that were then on the central committee had been there for many, many years. It was just sort of an automatic, nobody paid any attention, and they went. So as it turned out, because the McGovern people had gone out and done this, that it really was a landslide for the McGovern folks there.
Now, it's an interesting contrast, because I asked you to talk about what happened in '72 as a contrast to '68. In 1968, that energized process really wasn't taking place very well.
I'm sorry, yeah.
And I was in Missoula at the time. I was in graduate school, and I was the co-chairman of the campus McCarthy campaign. And so when I went to the Democratic Convention in Missoula, it was an extraordinary closed process. The fix was in. Some key players down there, I remember, knew the ropes. They knew how to make it all work. It was Tom Murry, the attorney, and Roger Murray, the railroad engineer, and Dink McGurl from the Army-Navy store, and George Sherwood from Warden's, and all those old party guys. They knew how to run it. And when you walked in the door, people didn't even show up. They just went out and gathered proxies from everybody and said, we've got all the votes here in our hands, and here's who we're going to put through to the state convention. So it was an extraordinarily closed process, and that was a real eye-opener for me. And I went to the state.
And Eddie Dusso was the chairman of the Democratic Central Committee at that time.
Well, no, that came in 2 years.
Okay.
That was after we had to change the rules. But in '68, I think Tom Murray was the chair.
That's right.
But the process was very closed, and so I happened to come over to the convention in Helena at the Placer Hotel, the state convention, and of course in the intervening period, as you remember, the night of the Montana election was the same night as the California election, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated.
That's right.
And it really, it just changed everything, and it made people so much more sensitive to closed processes. And I remember testifying at the Credentials Committee in Helena about how this proxy voting worked, and it didn't seem right and everything else. But nonetheless, because of what happened in places like Montana, and by the way, we had a winner-take-all, essentially, system. So when the final votes were tallied at the Placer Hotel, almost all the delegates except for one were for Hubert Humphrey, who didn't run, essentially, in open processes. And only one was for what was left of the Kennedy-McCarthy stuff, and that was Luke McCune. And so things were really, really sensitive at that time. We ended up, nationally they sensed that, and they set up a commission called the Hughes Commission very quickly before the convention. And they came in and they recommended, we got to quit this unit rule. We've got to stop having this winner-take-all stuff. We got to have stuff happen in the timeliness in the calendar year. Some people were selected were delegates were based on something that was happened 2 years before. We've got to reflect the vote of the grassroots. We've got to eliminate these proxies. And those were the kind of things that started to come out of the national as a result of Chicago, And so when you walked out of Chicago, there was a bit of a mandate for states to start taking a look at that spouse, wasn't there?
Well, there was, and there was not only what happened at the convention itself, but at the same time we had all of this fuss about the Vietnam War, the understatement.
Yes.
But there was a lot of fuss going on in Montana, in
Yes.
the nation. Kids were growing long hair,
Right.
and their parents didn't know what to do. They were behaving differently. The family relationships were changing from what they had been traditionally been for years before. Here in Mon-
And the women's
the,
movement
mo-
was
the women's
beginning
movement.
to,
There was all of these.
so that
there
roles were changing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And here in Montana, I remember one of the big changes. We depended so much on the people's voice. That was, that was the people's voice. Harry and Gretchen Billings were so much a part of that farm labor coalition that was the foundation for the progressive movement.
Tell
in
folks
Montana.
what the People's Voice was.
And the People's Voice was a publication, newspaper.
A weekly newspaper.
A weekly
That was
newspaper.
published here in Helena, had a wide circulation. It was supported primarily by farm groups, the Farmers Union, the Cooperative Farm Movement, and unions. And then individuals bought subscriptions to the People's Voice also. But through all of this, and I don't remember just exactly what year that was, the carpenters and Convention of the Carpenters and the Lumber and Sawmill Workers, which was one of probably the largest organization in the state FLCIO at that time, censured the People's Voice because of their position, because of Harry and Gretchen's position on the Vietnam War. And it just broke their hearts. It just Gretchen had been hired to be a secretary at that convention. She's taken notes as they're censuring that newspaper, and I'll never forget that. It was a horrible time. I was on the board for the Old People's Voice, representing the labor movement at the time. The result of that was that we eventually
tanked, right?
tanked.
Finally,
We shut it down.
After about 30 years.
Yes.
About 30 years of
And
existence.
we
it
went, and of course that led to a lot of other things that the people that Harry Billings was involved with. You played a role in that. We got him involved with the organization that we had put together to oppose the sales tax. And then when we finished that, I hired Harry to go to work at the state AFL-CIO. That wasn't without a lot of controversy. You might remember corporations put a lot of pressure on people because they thought they had finally got rid of Harry and Gretchen Billings, and I hired Harry to come to work at the Montana State AFL-CIO. And there was some times that I wasn't so sure that I was going to survive that because there was that sense and that feeling with people that had been so much a part of that system that both of you have described so well. There was just that sense that the wheels are coming off the wagon. What are we going to do? And so some of us had to, and the three of us worked on that. You think back about that. We had to work to figure out how we keep everybody in the family, and we were all going the same way. During the McGovern campaign, when there was so much consternation about the labor movement and what George Maney was doing and wasn't doing. You remember that?
Absolutely.
I think there was 14 international unions endorsed Richard Nixon. They were all of those presidents were on the executive council of the National AFL-CIO. So we had to figure out, and to George Maney's credit, and I had a tendency, I'm an old industrial unionist, and I had a tendency to be critical of George Maney from time to time for being a little too conservative, but he provided the leadership that allowed us to do in Montana what we did. And what we did, if you'll remember, when we adjourned the state Fed convention that year, we then, the meeting, the convention for the Labor for McGovern was called, and it just continued. And the labor movement pulled in behind George McGovern. In fact, there was a real shortage of finances and money in that campaign. As I recall, most of the campaign was run out of our office.
Well, you created a shadow organization instead of the official one. Now, when we look at what happened leading up between 68 and 72, because when we got to 72, that's when all this started to come together in your heavily
changes,
involvement.
Yes.
But following Chicago, with the recommendations that came out of the convention about openness, about proxies, about unit rule, about representation of minorities and women and young people and so on like that, all that stuff was coming out. They recommended, they created a commission. It was headed by George McGovern, incidentally.
That's right, yeah.
It was the McGovern
the
Commission,
McGovern
later
Commission,
called the
remember that?
McGovern-Fraser Commission, because Don Fraser from Minnesota was the vice chair, and he ascended to the chair when McGovern decided to run for president. But what they did was they recommended that each state reform its own processes, and they sent some guidelines down, and so Montana created a reform commission. Now, the interesting history on this is that I had come to Helena and taught school for a year. And then I went to work for the Forrest Anderson's reorganization. But in the Placer Hotel Convention in 1968, I ended up testifying on behalf of the McCarthy people about proxies and problems in Missoula in front of the Credentials Committee. And I think they noticed that. So when I'm over here working for Forrest Anderson, they were saying, who do we put on this reform commission? And somebody said, well, why don't we put that kid who testified from Missoula? You know, he was one of those liberals, you know. Well, so all of a sudden I'm on this commission to reform things with a lot of party regulars. Tom Hanrahan, wonderful Tom Hanrahan, State Rules Committee chair, lawyer, wonderful guy, headed it. But I remember the women who were on it. Gladys Mackler was on it, Lorene Tweet was on it, and Rita Lindblom was on it. Norma Kyle was on it. So all the bigwigs in the party of women were all on it.
Traditional leaders.
Yes.
They were the traditional party leaders. And so, but the interesting thing was, they all got together and said, you know, this idea of winner take all is not a good idea. So we formed a bunch of recommendations and went to a rules convention in Missoula, and that's when Eddie Dusso was the chairman in Missoula. And it was in the late summer or early fall of 1971, right after I'd been named executive director of the party. So I all of a sudden was no longer on the Reform Commission. I was a staffer. So Hanrahan said, sit down and shut up, you're a staffer now. But we went to a Reform Commission convention, which is only the party regulars, because the rules said only the officers of the party, not the legislators, had a vote in this. And the recommendation coming out of the Reform Commission was, let's stop this winner take all. And it was presented to, by the way, there were a bunch of other reforms, like the proxy vote and stuff like that. All of those were accepted. The timeliness, the openness, the trying to attract minorities and women, they were all accepted, but the winner-take-all argument was presented, and the party regulars that were all there said, you know, we won all that winner-take-all thing in '68, we kind of like it. And they rejected it. And that set the stage for what happened in 1972, Marilyn.
The McGovern takeover,
and Marilyn
yes.
and her friends took it all.
Yes, we did. We thought it was a pretty good idea too, because we took it all.
And
yes.
that's right.
And that's essentially, that's exactly what happened. And as I remember, the shock with a lot of the old party regulars and elected officials.
Well, don't look at me like that. But I was shocked. I was shocked too.
Yes, you
And
were
this was
shocked
at a
too.
convention at the Helena Civic Center.
Right,
right.
yes.
A
yes.
state convention.
Absolutely, yes. And we, at least our organization coming out of Butte, we had really packed the caucuses with McGovern people. We had the caucus in the courtroom in the county courthouse in Butte, big room. It was packed. People were standing along the walls, and every seat filled, and people out in the hallway. And of course, the majority of them were McGovern folks, because we had been out on the streets, which I would just like to throw in here. Some of those tactics and skills were things I learned in union halls growing up, because I come from a strong union background, and spent a lot of time as a kid in union halls. So anyway, we had all of had packed the courthouse, and the party regulars were there, the old timers called them, and They were very suspicious, of course, of who are all these new people, who are all these newcomers. And I'd just like to tell you a funny story about how I was elected state committee woman. And bear in mind that we were all very new to this process. We just knew that we had a chance to have a voice.
To be inside
to
the
be
hall.
inside the hall,
Yeah.
yes. So we're all in this room, and one of the elder gentlemen, the elder statesman really of the Butte Democratic Party, Spud Murphy, was
Only in Butte.
only
Spud
in Butte,
Murphy.
Spud Murphy, yes. Spud Murphy was sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, and Gub Shea was running the meeting, and said, okay, nominations
And by
for...
the way, whose son is now on the Montana
Yes,
Supreme
Jim
Court?
Shea, yes.
That's
This
correct.
is, yes, this is his father. Gub was running the meeting, calls for nomination for state committee woman. And Spud Murphy is sitting there and says, I nominate Helen White. And everybody started looking around. Finally, a voice from the back of the room yells, she's dead. and Spud says again, I nominate Helen White. Another guy yells across the room at him, for God's sakes, Spud, she's dead. And Spud goes, okay, and points to me and says, I nominate Red. And
Oh, that's a
yeah,
wonderful story.
that's how I became the state committee woman.
Oh, that is
Again, not knowing what a state committee woman did, but so that's how I went from that local caucus, moved up to the Helena Convention, and
the crux of that, of course, is what was done after
yes,
the state convention and after Miami, because with the winner take all with in Missoula, when the party regulars said, no, we can live with this winner take all,
yes.
we like it. The McGovern folks organized up, and when the time came to the convention in Helena, essentially the McGovern folks beat the party regulars back across the board, including our sitting U.S. Senator,
Yes.
Lee Metcalf, who simply wanted to go and be for his friend Ed Muskie, wanted to be a delegate, and he didn't get to be a delegate.
That's right,
All
yeah.
the party regulars suddenly found themselves in the alternate seats, and all the newbies, the McGovern people, were out here with the delegates and
Yes.
went to Miami Beach that way. There was a lot of consternation and everything else, but when you were then named to the party executive board, you were sitting there when the issue of what we call proportional representation came up. That was a way to get rid of the unit rule, to get rid of winner take all, and reflect the respective strength of the different candidates. And amazingly, after what happened in 1972, when the proportional representation rule came up, I remember, Jim, you saying, I think this is a pretty good idea now.
It gave us a chance. We were going to get another bite of the apple.
Well, both sides having lost, you've been an
sure.
experience. What does it mean to be on the outside
Exactly,
looking
yes,
in?
Yes, exactly.
That's right,
And
that's
that
right.
was the important thing, is that everybody now understood what that meant, to be cut out of even having any voice in the process.
And what that meant, and also what that meant, the potential for fracturing
Yes.
the relationship that we had all over the state, that would create a real problem in our effectiveness in electing people to public office in Montana,
exactly.
having an impact on the legislative process and all of that.
Absolutely,
But
yes.
there was I think back about that, and again, I was I was one of the alternates elected at the convention here in
Go to
Helena.
Miami Beach.
You're-
You were an alternate. I remember.
Not only that, they elected a guy by the name of Jim Murray as a delegate
From Wolf Point.
from a Blackfeet Indian, wasn't he? As I recall.
He was Mary Jo Murray's brother
That's right. That's right.
from up in
Now,
Wolf Point. Yeah.
now, as I say that, I'm not only Irish, I'm also a Native American myself, but I was left out of that process, and I think back about it, and I have to laugh now, but there was a lot of angst because
yeah.
Lee Metcalf, in our minds, was treated so badly, and whatever Lee Metcalf said was pretty much the way a lot of the old timers were going to go. People with the Farmers Union, the old timers with the labor movement.
Yes.
He was a Muskie guy. So we had to go in that. We had to go in that direction, and it didn't work. And so after all that was over, I think you're right. I think there was a realization that we have to figure out a way that everybody can have a voice and everyone can participate in that process. But there were really some wonderful things done during that period, because there was close friendships that were formed with people that were on the other side. That was
I think
pretty unique to Montana.
And I think the challenge was to not let the passions of national politics
That's right.
break down the relationships inside the boundary of Montana.
And I would agree with that, Evan. I think in the heat of the moment, in the passion of the moment at the Helena Convention, that wasn't very evident. But as we stepped back a little bit from it, there really was that realization. Well, I know for me personally, because I came from a strong union background. When the 13 unions endorsed Richard Nixon, it was just a crushing blow.
Oh, wow.
But there was an understanding that in Montana anyway, the Democratic Party spoke for working people. It spoke for those of us who really, outside of the borders of Montana, we wouldn't have had much of a chance, really. We were working class kids. We came from that background. But it was something precious we had here. And that was truly a sense that we can't let national passions tear apart what we've built here in Montana. And many of my dear friends, it came out of that experience in '72, where trying to sort of bridge that, I was McGovern, but I'm a Democrat, and you're a union, and some of my dear friends in Butte came out of the Women's Protective Union and were very active in that that whole issue with McGovern. But I think that was one of the very good things that came for a lot of us, was that sense we can't let what's going on a national level destroy what we've built.
I think Marilyn's right about
here
that.
in Montana.
There was another thing about that I recall. I always talk about those coalitions that came together at that time. The coalitions it started with the Farm Labor Coalition. All of a sudden, that branched out to include the women's movement, included the environmental movement, included low-income people were very involved in that whole thing, and so as we were building that coalition. And Evan, you played a major role in making this happen. An important and integral part of that whole coalition was the Democratic Party.
Absolutely,
the Democratic Party was very much part of that, and that goes back to our friend Ron Richards, and before that, the Democratic Party had really played that role. Was really close to the people's voice, very close to the. To all of our organizations. I got started in Laurel, worked in the refinery in Laurel, where my dad organized my local union. I got started by becoming the president of the Laurel Democratic Club because nobody else wanted the job, and Chet Blaylock was.
He looked at you and said, "Pick red." No.
That was about it, and I became. I
think red had a different meaning.
In that situation, it certainly did.
It did. Yes, it did. That's very good, Ellen. But my dad had organized the Laurel Democratic Club. He organized my local union, but he organized the Laurel Democratic Club. My wife Arlene was the treasurer of the Yellowstone County Democratic Central Committee before I was active in the before I became active in the party. So it was very clear that we were Democrats, and we weren't. When push came to shove, we weren't going to vote for Richard Nixon.
Absolutely.
Yes. And we weren't going to hurt our friends that were for another candidate. Yeah. We weren't going to.
By the way, we're talking about this in terms of small d democratizing the Democratic Party. and this is not meant to be partisan in a sense, but it was the Democratic Party that was most challenged during this period,
Yes.
that was most divided during this period, that then went through change during this period.
That's
and it
right.
was not a period in which the other major party in Montana went through that change. And so there was a conjoining of things here in terms of politics and government and that happened inside the Democratic Party that makes it stand out as reflective of the change period we're talking about. Now, part of that found its voice in terms of when we finally adopted rules as a party saying we want to reflect upward the strength of the reflective candidates, but we were still looking at a process that involved precinct committee people. So if you look back at Montana history, we had a bit of an interesting history in having presidential primaries. And I'll talk about that in a second, but what we ended up doing was proposing that instead of being precinct committee people being elected, why not have the voice of Democrats reflected by the ballot box, by having a presidential primary so that the actual pure votes for candidates could be reflected upward on a proportional basis. That would save a lot of angst, a lot of problems. There would be fewer squabbles between different divisions of the party over candidates because whatever numbers they got, they got. They got it in an open public process called a primary. And so we went ahead and did that, and I'll tell you how, but first let me take a second and refresh for those viewers we have how the presidential primary happened in Montana. Historically, in 1912, during the first progressive era, we look upon this period of the crucible of change as being a second progressive era in Montana politics. The first progressive era had the big changes in 1912, which included the Corrupt Practices Act, which was campaign reform, that included initiative and referendum were added to the Constitution of Montana at the time. And at that time, open primaries and the presidential primary were passed in 1912. And they were used, and you know who didn't like them? The Anaconda Company. The powers that be, the stock growers, the people that knew what backroom deals were all about, didn't like openness in in primaries, including presidential primaries. So after using the primaries in 1916 and 1920, there was an effort by the legislature to put on the ballot getting rid of the presidential primary. And they put it on the ballot, and the people defeated it.
That's right.
People said, no, we like this.
Yes.
So they did another election like that, and then after that, when Joe Dixon was governor, a progressive Republican, there was an effort again by the vested interest, by the Anaconda Company and the boys, to put it on the ballot again and kill the presidential primary. And they passed the bill to put it on the ballot, and Joe Dixon tried to veto the bill. And it was at that veto that he tried is where the court said, no, governors can't stop things that are going on to the ballot. If the legislature puts them on the ballot, that's the way it is. So Joe had to back away, and they put it on the ballot, and this time the powers that be won, and we got rid of the presidential primary. And we did not have a presidential primary then from that time forward, from 1924 when that was passed, until 1956. Interestingly, in 1956,
Folks that opposed that. was
the
a
reason
finger.
why it happened, in 1953, the legislature took it up, and they took it up at the behest of 6 Republican senators who were offended by the fact that in the 1952 National Republican Convention, that Robert Taft, the super conservative candidate, had gotten virtually all of the Montana votes instead of Eisenhower, who was kind of the middle-of-the-road candidate. And it was because of the processes. And so those 6 Republican senators said, gosh darn it, we need to have a presidential primary here. And they orchestrated it through, because they were Republican senators, even though the Anaconda Company opposed it. And in 1956, we had a presidential primary. Immediately after which, the Anaconda Company killed it again. And it lay dormant until in 1973, late 73, I was talking with a fellow named Pat Williams. We all know
And
Pat.
you guys
Yes.
drafted you guys drafted the bill.
And we thought, well, I think we need this primary to reflect this, what we're saying. Why don't we let the voters say how many delegates? But the Republican Party doesn't want this. So we crafted a bill that said there shall be a presidential primary in Montana. And the way you get onto the ballot if you're a candidate is you get 1,000 signatures from each congressional district and you're on the ballot. Okay? And it said it's optional. The political parties are not forced to use this presidential primary. They can choose to use it or they can choose not to use it. And in this case, of course, the Republican Party chose not to use it, and to this day they still don't use it as a basis of their votes. The Democratic Party then said, yes, we want to use it, and they made it part of their rules. And so we took that bill, and Pat and I took it to a young fellow by the name of John Murphy, often known as Landslide Murphy.
Landslide Murphy.
Landslide Murphy was a freshman legislator from Stanford, who had won by a tie vote, and when they came to breaking the tie, it was the vote of the governor got to say, in the rules in those days, the governor said, okay, it's a tie, I got to pick this guy or somebody else, I pick John Murphy, and he was thereafter known as Landslide Murphy.
That's right.
But Murphy passed the bill. And so then the next time we had to have delegate selection, instead of fighting each other internally in the trenches at the county level over precinct committee people, candidates came in and had to compete for votes, and then those were reflected upwards. And that is reflective, I think, of the change that we're talking about in the crucible of change, that what is happening is we were empowering everyday citizens with choices and the opportunity to participate and having it mean something. How do you get inside that room?
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And that is, and to my mind, that was true small d democracy, because it allowed people to go into a voting booth and pick who they wanted, rather than trying to. One of the things I remember kind of in that period between 68 and 72 was trying to wrap my head around all of these arcane rules on who could be there and who couldn't, and how somebody was elected, which discouraged participation, except by the deal makers and the Anaconda Company and those folks. So to encourage and to open up the democratic process and the Democratic Party, which I still believe that that's what the Democratic Party represents, are those little people down here who can't figure out the arcane rules, but they have a right to have a voice in the process and participate.
And you were part of the implementation of that, because you were elected.
Right.
When Red went to the state convention. When Red went to the state convention and became a position on the state party executive board.
Exactly.
So
yes,
I think I was still
you were executive
director,
yes, you were.
Executive secretary, we called it back
yeah.
then, for a while yet. And you were there, and we had the process of trying to implement all this stuff in a way to create openness.
Right.
And it was kind of fun to be able to be in the process, especially once we got by the idea that both sides had figured out that losing wasn't good.
So, yes.
That being on the losing side of winner take all. I mean, if nothing seemed more undemocratic, either in Montana or, think about it, California, where it was winner take all.
Yes. Yeah.
Think about every delegate in California.
Well, one of
suddenly
the things,
being for one candidate or another.
One
So
of the
we had to
things
make it
I
work in
remember,
Montana,
Evan,
yeah.
after that Helena convention is, even though it was wonderful to be on the winning side, because we had been on the losing side, now the McGovern delegates, but I remember having this sense of watching people like Lee Metcalf and all of the regular party leaders walking out thinking, now what do we do? You
Yeah.
know, now what do we do? How do we?
Well, the wheels were coming off the wagon.
Well,
Just to so many,
Yes,
so many folks.
but if we lost all of that knowledge and expertise, it wasn't going to do the Democratic Party any good.
That's right.
And
That's
if it
really
didn't
right.
do the Democratic Party any good, it certainly was not going to do labor any good. And I mean, that was where I came from. That those were the two organizations that, for people like myself and other working class kids in Montana, those were the organizations that represented us.
Would bring about needed
Right.
change.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting thing too about all of that, I was always an organization guy. I was always thinking about how do we facilitate getting more people involved at the local level, boots on the ground. And back in those days, you know, the labor movement didn't put much money into political campaigns. We didn't have much money. What we did is I always said, we had the best grassroots organization in the state. And so as those rule changes came about, Evan, and again, you really played a role in emphasizing all of this, focusing on this, was the boots on the ground
Yes,
aspect.
yeah.
Yet people had to be involved at the local level in their communities to make their voice heard. The deal with Chaz Jeniker and the truck,
Yeah.
I think you guys kind of redefined boots on the ground. But it's a great example. That's exactly what we're talking about. Just local people involved, and out of that, what happens is leaders develop and are selected. If I hadn't had that opportunity a lot of years ago, I would have never become a leader in the labor movement.
Well,
there wouldn't have been
yeah.
any place for me to go.
And it certainly had a huge impact on my life, obviously. I stayed involved at so many levels. And one of the lessons that I took out of all of that served me very, very well in other endeavors, was that coalition building, how to identify who you had a common interest with, and how to develop those
right.
coalitions. And that was a really, really valuable lesson. And the other thing too is just being able to speak in a way that hopefully would help people see, in Montana, we are this one big family. And yeah, you know, we might get in spats and we might bicker but in the end, we are all this one family.
We just agreed to disagree occasionally.
Exactly, yes. And sometimes those disagreements got pretty lively, but
That's right.
that ability to come together afterwards, I think, and again, that very solid lesson of, no matter what, we cannot let our passions that are inflamed by national politics tear apart what we in Montana have built over generations. It wasn't just me or you. I mean, we are second and third generation of that kind of
and Marilyn's absolutely
foundation.
right about that, and that's what developed through all of that, and through all of those decades of people working together, was we developed a political culture in Montana that was really unique.
Absolutely.
Surrounded by right-to-work states.
Yes.
I mean, states couldn't pass right-to-work, and 53 and 58 had two horribly tough right-to-work
yeah.
fights in Montana. Montana would have probably become a right-to-work state had it not been for the Montana Farmers Union and a lot of the clergy in the state who was a
Exactly.
part of that coalition movement,
Yes.
helping us in that whole thing. That was our culture. It was.
Well, you know, if you look at it and you think about the period in the crucible of change, that there was a pent-up desire of the grassroots of Montana to have more empowerment, more voice. It's found an answer in many different ways. We talked about a lot of them on this series. Part of the art form of what we were kind of engaged in was how to build structures in the Democratic Party that allowed that voice to
Yes.
be reflected in a way that did not cause divisions, but caused a coming together. So these processes of, including this presidential primary, took us away from fighting with each other inside little rooms
Right.
to coalescing for things we wanted to change policy-wise, because we didn't have those little fights. Those fights were resolved by votes, by openness, by participation, by crafting rules of fairness and timeliness. And those things all occurred. You were engaged in it very heavily in a lot of ways, as a big winner, a big loser, and someone who was always engaged in the process of trying to make it work for everyone. You were engaged in it as a newcomer, saying, hey, what's this about? Oh, I guess this is going to get us in the room. And helping implement those processes. I was lucky enough to be involved with it to try to help form it and shape it in a way that helped us to move forward. So it's a very interesting story of empowerment inside an institution that is important to the body politic of Montana. You know, your reflections.
Well, I would absolutely agree with what you've said, Evan, and the the two different perspectives. She said, me as a newcomer, Jim as someone who had successfully, in a lot of ways, negotiated the old party structure. But I think the real story here is, even though at 72, the old party structure maybe didn't see any need for change. Things had worked well. And this new group comes in to open it up, to be able to be a part of it. But I think the real story there is we did accomplish that, we did do it, and afterwards, those of us who stayed involved were able to acknowledge all that the other group had brought to to us and to the state, and we were we had this wonderful, unique way of getting things done in Montana, and that we were able to do that in a way that I think the party and Montana came out of it stronger than we were.
Well, while we were keeping labor and people like Jim, who were the kind of the strength and the almost the backbone of the party, we were bringing in this period of change, more minorities, women, younger people. You fit two of those categories. You were a woman and a young person at the time, and that was like whole new stuff. And so we were able to do that successfully. So that's why we call this small d democratizing the Democratic Party. And it was an institutional change of significance to the history of Montana during that period. We're running, see, I told you the hour would go awfully fast, and it has. And I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to sit at the table with friends like you who've been through so much together with. We've made a lot of change together. This particular thing was very important, and it's stood the test of time since the early 1970s in keeping Montana a people-oriented state. We'll look forward to see you in the next Crucible of Change episode.